I told you, storytellers are omniscient. I know everything.
Quiet on set. And action!
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Action Podcast, where we talk about all things movies. And today, we are talking about A Christmas Carol, but not just A Christmas Carol, The Muppets Christmas Carol, which came out in 1992. This movie was directed by Brian Henson, the son of Jim Henson. It was produced by, the producers were Martin G. Baker and Brian Henson. Co-producer was Jerry Jewell. Associate producer was Alexander de Grunwald. The line producer was David Barron, and the executive producer was Frank Oz. This movie is based on the novel by Charles Dickens, and the screenplay was written by Jerry Jewell. Now, before we get into this, something that should be noted about this film is that it started production and came out 2 years after Jim Henson's death. Nobody was sure if the Muppets could survive after his death, but Christmas and the spirit of Jim saved the Muppets. Now, this version of The Christmas Carol also sticks very close to the original, so it is a darker Muppets film, but if you ask me, it's the best version of The Christmas Carol. Now, before we get into how this film was made, just really quickly, we're going to do a summary of the film. In The Muppets Christmas Carol, the Muppets perform the classic Dickens holiday tale, and they perform the, Christmas Carol. Each of the Muppets is assigned a character, with Gonzo being Charles Dickens himself, Kermit the Frog playing Bob Cratchit. Upon others, we'll go over the cast a little bit later. The story follows a greedy old man named Ebenezer Scrooge, who receives visits from 3 spirits of Christmas, past, present, and future. Together they show him the error of his ways, and he seems past any hope of redemption and happiness, but in the end, he changes his ways, and he's essentially saved. And with that, let's get right into how this film was made. We're going to start with how this project came to be. The film came from a deal that agent Bill Haber made with Disney and ABC for a TV movie that would put the Muppets into Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Now, the original plan was it was going to be a long-form TV Christmas special until Disney changed their minds and told Brian Henson they wanted him to make it for the big screen instead. And when the young Henson received this news, it scared him. He had never made a movie for the big screen before, and he tried to get others to do it. Frank Oz, though, convinced him to stay on as director. Henson didn't watch any other adaptations of The Christmas Carol because he didn't want to end up copying and pasting from them. He instead wanted to focus on the novel itself. So he and Jewell decided to lean more into the darkness of Dickens' story, because they wanted to rely more on the original text. Now, most Muppet movies, actually all Muppet movies, generally follow an old comedy formula of 2 jokes a page. But Christmas Carol allowed the young Henson to create a bit of a darker world that was more in sync with stuff he had done previously. This kind of scared Disney, and while Henson says Jeffrey Katzenberg was enormously respectful to work with, his notes whenever they read the script would always come back saying things like, "This could be a lot funnier," and his first note after they tested the film practically said that there wasn't enough laugh out loud moments in the film, to which Henson replied, "Well, it's not really that kind of comedy." And that's kind of how The Muppets Christmas Carol came to be. This was the first Muppet movie that wasn't an original story. Now, the young Henson felt like it was a good choice to consider them ensemble performers and put them into a movie because they were running out of 3-act original Muppet movie ideas that they could do. And it turned out really well, if you ask me. Now, when writing the script, Jerry's writing actually made it so that you knew or you could pick up on previous relationships that the characters had. So an example would be Kermit and Piggy. You could kind of pick up on the relationship they had before, because in this they were set up as husband and wife, Bob and Emily Cratchit. But he also made it so they weren't something that everyone would focus on. It wasn't something that you needed to know to follow along in this movie. Now we're going to rewind a little bit. This film actually started as a parody of A Christmas Carol because that's what they thought everyone expected from the Muppets. They thought everyone wanted lots of jokes and lots of laughs. And originally, Gonzo was going to be the ghost of Christmas yet to come, and Piggy was going to be the ghost of Christmas present. Now, this was when it was supposed to be an ABC special, but they ultimately ended up throwing the idea out because of Jerry Jewell, actually. Jerry was the one that said that Dickens' prose is magical and needs to be put in the movie, that the story needed to be told properly and not be made fun of the way they had originally planned. Now, there was a stark contrast between Dickens and Henson, and that's what made the movie. Dickens is more dark, and the Muppets is colorful, happy, and they kind of clashed, but that clash made the movie amazing. It made it what it is. They combined well. It was dark and serious in places it needed to be, so it was Dickensian. And in others, it was bright, colorful, funny. It was the Muppets. Now, I've got a little bit about the storyboard process. There was a scene in the film where Gonzo tries to get Rizzo to jump down from a fence, and Rizzo has a bag of jelly beans. Now, this was thought up by Henson and one of the storyboard artists. Henson did a little storyboard for it because he thought they may need it, and he actually thought it would be cut. When they shot it, though, it was so funny, and they loved it so much that they kept it in the final cut. And another thing about the storyboard and screenplay, there were actually 3 total songs cut from the film. I'm sure most of you know about at least one of them, but there are actually 3. And we're going to talk about 2 of them right now, and we'll talk about the third one a little bit later. 2 of them were cut before filming, and that's why we're going to talk about them right now. The first song that was cut was Room in Your Heart. This song was a song sung by Dr. Bunsen Honeydew. He, before this, had never had his own song before, but it ended up being cut from the film and it never made it to production. Now, the second song that was cut before filming was Chairman of the Board. This song was sung by Sam Eagle, but like Room in Your Heart, it did not make it to production. Both of these songs are actually included in the official Muppets Christmas Carol soundtrack. So if you want to listen to it, you can find that on Spotify. I've listened to both of those songs probably 30 times today because I've had it on repeat while I've done my research all day long. The third song cut from the film is When Love Is Gone, and that's the one we'll talk about a little bit later because that one actually did make it to production and it was filmed, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. Alright, and now we're going to jump into the casting. I have 2 different lists for casting. One contains the voice actors of all the Muppets and some of the human actors in the film. The other one contains the Muppets and what characters they portrayed. So we're going to start with the official casting list, which has the voice actors and the humans in the Muppets, and then we'll move on to the Muppet casting list. The casting was done by Susan Crowley, Mike Felton, and Gilly Poole. Starting at the top of our list, we have Michael Caine as Scrooge. Caine was the first offer. He really wanted to do this film, and when he signed on, he had no idea that it was young Henson's first film. Now, someone that was considered for the role of Scrooge was Tim Curry. They considered him, but they ultimately decided that he matched the Muppet comedy too well, and they continued to look for someone who could play the role more serious. Caine was Henson's only choice for Scrooge once they decided they did not want to do a parody. And Caine had always wanted to work with the Muppets, so when he was asked to work with the Muppets, he immediately said yes. He'd been working through the 70s and the 80s, watching all of his friends get to work with the Muppets, and he honestly was just waiting for his turn to get to work with them, and he finally got it by playing Scrooge in the Muppets Christmas Carol. Next up, we have David Goles as the voice of the Great Gonzo, Robert Marley, Bunsen Honeydew, Bettina Cratchit, Rat, and Zoot. Up next, we have Steve Whitmer as the voice of Rizzo the Rat, Bean Bunny, Kermit the Frog, Beaker, Belinda Cratchit, Beetle, Lips, and Pig Gentleman. Steve Whitmer took over as the voice of Kermit after Jim passed, and this was actually his first time voicing Kermit, and he was really nervous as he had big shoes to fill. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Steve Whitmer being Kermit in just a little bit. Next up, we have Jerry Nelson as the voice of Tiny Tim Cratchit, Jacob Marley, Ghost of Christmas Present, and he actually also controlled the facial expressions from offset, and we'll talk about how he did that in a bit. He voiced Lou Zealand, Ma Bear, Mouse, Mr. Applegate, Penguin, Pig Gentleman, Pops, and Rat. Frank Oz was the voice of Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, Sam Eagle, Animal, George the janitor, horse and carriage driver, and vegetable salesman. David Rudman was the voice of Rat, Peter Cratchit, Old Joe, and the Swedish Chef. Don Austin was the performer for Ghost of Christmas Present and Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. Robert Tigner was the performer for Ghost of Christmas Past and Yet to Come, and he was also the voice for some of the additional Muppets. Karen Prell was the performer for Ghost of Christmas Past. Jessica Fox was the voice of Ghost of Christmas Past. Then you have Steve McIntosh as Fred, Meredith Brown as Belle, Robin Weaver as Clara, Raymond Couthard, Russell Martin, Theo Sanders, Christopher Milnes, and Edward Sanders, all as one of the young Scrooges, the main one being Raymond Couthard. He's the one who we see at Fozziwig's party and in the scene where Belle breaks up with him. He's the oldest of the young Scrooges. Now, all of these actors are among many, many, many other actors and performers for additional Muppets. I am not going to go through all of them because the list is very, very long. If you wish to know the rest of them, I recommend you go to IMDb full cast and crew for The Muppet Christmas Carol. It's a very long list, though. Now, on to the Muppets cast. You have the Great Gonzo as Charles Dickens, Michael Caine as Scrooge, Kermit the Frog as Bob Cratchit, Miss Piggy as Emily Cratchit, Rizzo the Rat as himself, Fozzie Bear as Fozziwig, Statler and Waldorf as Jacob and Robert Marley, and Robin, Kermit's nephew, as Tiny Tim. Now, another thing that comes into play before you start filming a movie is costumes. So you've got casting and costumes, and I've got a bit on costuming here. Now, costume designers were Anne Hollowood and Polly Smith. Hollowood had worked with the Muppets since the 70s, and Smith joined the Muppets in 1984 with the Muppets Take Manhattan. And a lot of the Muppets were oddly shaped, and they were not full-size human creatures. Now, even though they are not normally shaped or human creatures, the Muppets are still dressed in historically accurate styled clothing just like the human actors are. They do have to accommodate for the Muppets' odd shapes because this makes their silhouettes look different from that of humans when they're in their costumes. So, as an example, Miss Piggy does not wear a corset, but the neckline and the sleeve shapes remained the same as they would have been in Dickens' time, despite, no matter what the shape of the Muppet was, the neckline and the sleeves remained the same. There were no changes made, no alterations made to make those fit the Muppets better. And we're just going to talk about a few of the costumes. We're going to start with Kermit's costume. Kermit was Bob Cratchit. He wore a high-waisted coat, which was a little out of fashion for the 1840s, but this helped to reflect his character's financial situation. The Cratchits were a poor family, so it makes sense that they wouldn't be caught up on the latest fashions because they wouldn't be able to afford it. Dr. Bunsen, Honeydew, and Beaker, they wore a lot of layers. They had a shirt, a waistcoat, a coat, and a greatcoat, and they also wore ties. So they had more money than the Cratchits did, and you could tell because they were properly dressed for the winter. Gonzo, who was Charles Dickens, he had a fancy frock coat that had a touch of the Muppets, as you will notice. He wore a costume that had many different patterns in it, so that was more of a Muppets touch to the Dickens and 1840s time period. Some of the patterns that you can see on him, he has striped socks, a plaid waistcoat, checked pants. It was Dickens-made Gonzo. Next up, we have Miss Piggy. She was Emily Cratchit. Now, she wears a plaid dress, and its shape is similar to that of dresses from the 1840s, but again, she has no corset. And like Kermit's costume, her costume is a bit out of fashion because of the big sleeves on her dress, and again, that just goes to show that the family is poor. They don't have money to keep up with the latest trends of fashion like everybody else does. And now we're going to get into some of the human characters here. You have Fred and his wife Clara. They're the opposite of the Cratchits. As you can see in the movie, their costumes are more fashionable, they're up to date. They reflect the height of fashion in the 1840s because they come from money. They have the money to stay caught up with the latest fashions, and you can see that in Clara's dress and in the suit that Fred wears. When you rewind in the movie a bit, you have young Scrooge. He's seen in a very generic 18th century outfit, which kind of makes it difficult to pinpoint the time period that he's in, but you can probably assume it's between 1775 and the early 1780s. And then at Fozziwig's party, not parties, the costumes are more distinct. You'll notice the female dresses reflect that of the 1780s to early 1790s, and the men's suits reflect that as well. They wanted this film to be accurate to the novel, and the costumes push more towards that accuracy to the original novel and the time periods of that film. So they just add to that accuracy that they were shooting for. And that is everything that I have on pre-production for the film. We're now going to get into filming and everything that comes with that. I'm going to start with some of the practical effects that you see in the film. One of the first ones that I have listed here is the ice skating scene where the penguins and Kermit are ice skating during his song One More Sleep Till Christmas. This ice skating scene was Henson's idea. And in order to pull that off, they had no ice because the puppets are being controlled from underneath the set. So instead of having ice, there was an empty hole, and in the hole were the puppeteers, and they were down there just scooting around on chairs, and the ice was added later in post. And we're just gonna skip around with these practical effects throughout the movie. I'm not going in any particular order. The next one I have is with The Ghost of Christmas Past. The Ghost of Christmas Past was originally meant to be shot in mineral oil because the oil made it so that the puppet's rod would vanish completely, and it made the puppet appear to be flying. She ended up being shot in water, though, because the pump they had to filter the oil had pool water in it, and none of them knew that it was there. So when they turned the pump on, the oil and the water mixed, and the oil turned completely white. And when that happened, Henson said, "Oh, that's all right, we can just buy more." But the thing about mineral oil is it's actually really expensive, and they didn't have any more money in the budget to spend on mineral oil. So the producers looked at him and said, "We can't do that. She's gonna have to be shot in water." So she was shot underwater, and another thing about The Ghost of Christmas Past is she was the only puppet that they made with realistic features. I'm sure you noticed she looks kind of creepy, and that is because they did give her realistic features and then shot her underwater, and that's why she looks like that. And the next practical effect that I have is in the scene where we see Kermit walking down the street with his nephew Robin on his shoulder. Again, Kermit is Bob Cratchit and Robin is Tiny Tim. Now, in this scene, we see the entirety of Kermit walking down the street. Now, this effect they needed to pull off was making a puppet look like he was walking down the street completely on his own with no assistance at all. And in order to pull this off, they built a special rig that was like a giant drum, and this rig served as the ground. And instead of a green screen, they used a blue screen because, well, Kermit is green, so you can't really use a green screen with him because he would disappear. The rig, as Kermit's feet would move and take steps, the wheel would turn beneath him to make it look as though he was walking down the street. And if you look very closely when you watch the film, you can see the rig turning. You can see the ground moving beneath him. You have to watch the ground very closely, though. And underneath the set, or next to it, there was a guy turning the drum, and he had to be in perfect time with Kermit. So if Kermit stopped walking and did like a little dance step, then the wheel would also have to stop, so that it was perfectly timed and matched up together, character and effect. And the last practical effect that I have is about our dear friend, the Ghost of Christmas Present. Now, he was partially puppet, but his face was actually animatronic, and when I mentioned before in cast that the man who was his voice also controlled his face offset, that's what I mean. He was controlling the animatronic, making his mouth move, making him blink, and then there was a man inside of the costume being the character himself and walking around as the Ghost of Christmas Present. And he was the most complicated puppet to make, as he was the only animatronic puppet on set. Now, earlier I mentioned that Steve Whitmer took over as the voice of Kermit after Jim Henson had passed away. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit of the other acting that we see in the film now. The other voice actors on set, they didn't really give Whitmer very many pointers on how to do the voice of Kermit. They kind of just let him learn how to do it on his own. Whitmer had spent many years working with Jim and watching him be Kermit, and he said one valuable piece of advice that he did get was from Frank Oz, the voice of Fozzie, Miss Piggy, and many other Muppets. Oz told him that he already knew how to puppeteer, and that he's done his own characters, but when he's trying to be Kermit, he first needs to try to be Jim. He needs to be Jim first, and that's where his years of working with Jim came into play. Whitmer knew that Jim had a certain stance he did when he played Kermit, and that when Jim was doing the voice of Kermit, he would frown and the voice of Kermit would come out. He said that knowing which parts of Jim went into Kermit and what parts of Jim didn't go into Kermit were the keys to being Kermit. For Whitmer to really get the hang of Kermit, he had to become Jim being Kermit. It was a process with quite a few layers, so in the end, he ended up being Jim, who was being Kermit, and Kermit was being Bob Cratchit. So it was acting within acting within acting, which is a paradox if you think about it too hard. He also got to work with Paul Williams, who wrote the soundtrack for the film. Whitmer got to work with him, and he said working with Williams during the pre-record of the songs also helped him. Williams was able to help Whitmer really dial down on his Kermit voice, and it made Whitmer feel much better about going in and doing the dialogue on set. And that is how Whitmer kind of transitioned into taking over as Kermit after Jim passed away. Michael Caine, who was Scrooge, when he was asked about acting with the Muppets, he said the secret to acting with the Muppets is to treat them as you would a live actor, not like puppets with performers controlling them from below. And he also said that when they were doing scenes, you could see the puppeteers controlling the Muppets and you could see their mouths moving, but the puppeteers wasn't where you would look. You would look at the Muppets because they were so real. They were the actors, and the puppeteers, they were also actors, but the Muppets were the actors that you were working directly with, if that makes sense. You're technically also working directly with the puppeteers, but the Muppets are the ones right there. And because they look so real, that's where your eyes tend to go. I have one more little tidbit of acting, and then we'll move on to some other filming facts about this movie. When Caine signed on to this film, he had never sang before. And when he started singing the songs for this, when he sang his song, he was actually surprised that he even could sing, and that's just a fun little fact for you. We're going to move on to the filming of this movie now. There's a scene in the movie where Scrooge wakes up and drops to his knees. It's pretty close to the end, and he thanks the spirits. And he was asked to do this 3 times. Caine at the time was 59 years old, keep that in mind. So Caine did it twice, and then he walked up to Henson and told him to try dropping down to his knees without his hands. So Henson did, and that's when he realized just how difficult it was to drop down to your knees without your hands. Caine then looked at him and said it was harder for him because he was a lot older than the young Henson at the time. Henson was 28 years old at the time of production during this movie. Caine did wear knee pads under his trousers when they filmed this, and while they did help a bit, they didn't help enough to make it so that it was easy for him to walk the next couple days. It was actually, he still had a hard time walking for the next couple days afterwards, and that probably had something to do with his age as well. In the film, there wasn't much improvising outside of physical improvising in the film because they wanted to remain faithful to the original film. However, when they would start filming, after the cut was announced, the Muppet actors would continue talking and doing things as the Muppets, and some of those things did end up in the film. I'm just not sure which ones, but some of those things did end up in the film still. Now, The Muppets Christmas Carol was filmed at Shepperton Studios in the UK. The movie started filming on June 11th, 1992, and it wrapped on August 15th, 1992. The film was given an estimated budget of $12 million. The production designer Val Strazovic and his crew transformed the stages at Shepperton Studios into the vast, snow-covered Victorian London you can find in Dickens' works. All the parts of the set could be dismantled and reinserted to accommodate the puppeteers working beneath and around the set. So it was kind of raised up, and all of the puppeteers would work like underneath the set in little holes in the set, and they would raise the Muppets up, and that's how they would get the Muppets into the scene. So all of their acting was done underneath the set, and all of the Muppets' acting was done above the set. The opening of the song Scrooge has over 100 puppets in it, and in the film as a whole, there are 280 puppets. And that's all I have for you on filming. There are a ton of stories online that I found, but in order to save time and not have this go on forever, I'm not going to include all of the stories that I found. So we're now going to move on to the editing process of this film and the scoring. We're going to start with editing. Earlier, I mentioned that there were 3 songs that were cut from the film, and only one of them actually made it to production and was recorded. And that song was When Love Is Gone, which is sung by Ebenezer Scrooge's love interest, Belle. Now, this song, When Love Is Gone, was cut from the film for the theatrical release, and the reason it was cut was because Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was president of Disney Studios at the time, didn't like ballads because kids don't like ballads. They didn't think that kids would be able to sit through it. But it was a very important part of the story, but they cut it anyways because they were asked to. Katzenberg thought it was best to cut it, and Henson said that if he'd been older, he would have asked Katzenberg if that was a demand because he didn't actually want to cut it. They, however, had an agreement. The song would be cut for the theatrical release as long as it was put back in after the initial theatrical release. On video, the song was back in, but when high-definition video came along, they needed the negative to go back to that better version. However, Disney lost the negative. They searched for years to find this thing, and they finally found it about a year ago. Every year, Henson would remind them 3 to 4 times that they were obligated to find it because of their agreement. They never found a negative, but they did find an IP, which is they found a first strike interpositive of the reel. And when they said that they found this, Henson went, "Oh, that's it." So the scene can now be found on Disney Plus in the extras section. In the extras section, you can also find the full version of the Muppets Christmas Carol, and the song is also in that one. So there are 2 versions of the Muppets Christmas Carol on Disney Plus. There's one without When Love Is Gone, and there's one with When Love Is Gone. Now, while we're on the topic of songs, we're going to start talking about the music and the score of the film. The songs were written by Paul Williams and the score by Miles Goodman. According to Brian Henson, there were 2 songwriters that wrote songs that worked really well for the Muppets, Paul Williams and John Denver. Both were folk artists. Henson recruited Williams to do the Muppets Christmas Carol. Paul Williams hadn't done anything with the Muppets since the original Muppet movie because he went through a dark time and addiction shortly after that. By the time work had started on the Muppets Christmas Carol, though, Williams was sober, and he really wanted to do this to prove that he was still a good songwriter. Now, the young Henson said that Williams responded well to the script because it was a story of redemption, and Williams connected with that. When Henson wanted Williams, Disney asked him if he was sure about the decision, and they also asked him if Williams was even still working. Henson was sure of his decision. Henson had never done a musical before, so he was nervous about the songs, but when he got Williams, the songs and Williams turned out to be fantastic. This proved Disney wrong, and it proved to Henson that he had nothing to worry about. And it also proved to Williams that he was in fact still a good songwriter. In the spring of 1992, which was 16 years after Williams first started working with the Muppets, Williams was walking around a park in LA. He was thinking about Christmas, and that's when he sat down on a bench to start working on songs for the Muppet Christmas Carol. He said he was worried because this was the first project he'd worked on sober in a while. But once he sat down, the words for the song Scrooge just started coming to him. And he knew then that he had nothing to worry about. He also said that he was glad he had his tape recorder on him because he just couldn't write fast enough. The words were just coming to him so quickly. And the very last thing I have about the score and the soundtrack is about the song One More Sleep Till Christmas that Kermit sings in the beginning of the film. This song is based around Paul and his children, and I just thought that was really cool. That was a fun fact that I wanted to share with y'all. And with that, I'm going to start wrapping up the film. We're going to get into box office and social impact. The Muppets Christmas Carol hit theaters in the UK on December 18th, 1992. And in the US, it hit theaters just 1 week earlier on December 11th, 1992. It was a little bit later than Henson wanted, but it still performed well in theaters. Now I have two different box office lists. This first one is for all of the releases that The Muppets Christmas Carol has seen. So for all of the releases, the domestic box office is at $27,381,507. The international box office is at $5,892,024. And the worldwide is at $33,273,531. The next box office list that I have is for the original release. For the original release, the domestic box office was at $27,281,507. The international box office was at $1,910,927. And the worldwide box office added up to $29,192,434. And The Muppets Christmas Carol has been re-released 3 different times. It was re-released in 2017 on December 8th in the UK. And again in 2020 on December 18th, it was re-released in the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And then just last year in 2022, it was re-released on December 2nd in the UK and New Zealand. The Muppets Christmas Carol has won 2 awards and has been nominated for 1. At the Fanta Festival in 1993, Brian Henson was the winner for Best Direction, and this one completely blew my mind. It's so cool. It was nominated in 1993 for a Grammy for Best Musical Album for Children. If you ask me, it's really unfortunate that that didn't win. I think it should have won. And then the last award we have here in 1993, it won the Movie Guild Award for Best Movie for Families. The last thing I have is the social impact of this film. Before I get into that, just one last thing. I want to give you the runtimes for the movie. Because there are 2 different versions on Disney Plus, you have the full version, and then you have the one without When Love Is Gone. The one without When Love Is Gone is 87 minutes, and then the full version is 89 minutes. And now we're going to move on to social impact. In 1993, the year after The Muppets Christmas Carol came out, it skipped the rental market and went straight to sell-through, and it made millions of dollars once people were able to buy it. So that just means it didn't go through a period where you could just rent it. It just went straight to you can buy this film. The Muppets Christmas Carol saved the Muppets franchise and made them current again. Shortly after The Muppets Christmas Carol came Muppets Treasure Island and Muppets Tonight, the ABC series. The Muppets Christmas Carol also helped the Muppets to achieve Jim Henson's dream of seeing his beloved Muppet characters in Disney parks. According to Empire, his characters were introduced to the Disney parks in 2005, but according to Mouse Planet and several other Disney bloggers, vloggers, and other Disney sites, the Muppets were actually introduced into the Disney theme parks in 2001 on opening day of California Adventure, which was February 8th of 2001. And finally, this film is still enjoyed by many every year and continues to appeal to audiences of all ages to this day. I think The Muppets Christmas Carol is the most accurate Christmas Carol film out there. This is one of my absolute favorite movies, and I'm so excited that I got the opportunity to talk about this movie with you guys. I just wanted to wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I will be back in the new year with episode 6 of season 2. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. Enjoy the rest of your Christmas and New Year's weeks with your families. Don't forget to follow us on social media. It's TikTok and Instagram at actionpodcast.cs. I post things on both of those occasionally. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube at Action Podcast. You can listen to us on any listening platform, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, literally anywhere. So go check us out. And again, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Go enjoy the rest of your Christmas and New Year's with your family, and I will see you all in the new year with season 2, episode 6.
After all, there's only one more sleep till Christmas Day.